The wind in the San Luis Valley never truly slept. In the summer of 1891, it was a constant dry breath that scoured the land, carrying the red dust of the high desert and the sharp, clean scent of sagebrush. It worried the corners of the canvas-roofed shacks in Dry Creek and whistled a lonesome tune through the frames of the new buildings rising near the proposed railroad spur. The town itself was little more than a hopeful scar on the earth, huddled at the feet of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, which stood like silent, purple-robed judges against the vast, indifferent sky. In the small, fiercely swept cabin of the Hart family, Eliza felt the wind as a familiar pressure against the walls. At 20, she moved with the quiet economy of a woman taught from birth that idleness was a sin and duty a shield. Her hands, though chapped from lye soap and garden soil, were deft as she mended a tear in her father's shirt, her stitches small and even, a reflection of the Quaker order she carried within her. She was the daughter of Pennsylvanian sodbusters who had come west chasing the promise of a land that would be truly their own, only to find the soil stubborn and the water a fickle tyrant. Their life was a ledger of debts and prayers, and Eliza's unspoken purpose was to guard the family's honor as fiercely as she guarded their dwindling flour supply. Helping them escape the tightening grip of their land note was a prayer she said with every chore, a weight that settled deep in her bones. The name Cole Sullivan was spoken in the valley with a mixture of resentment and respect. He was the owner of the Twin Spurs Ranch, a man who had arrived a decade earlier with little more than a fine horse and a government-issue rifle. He had not sought gold, but grass and water. He'd had the foresight to buy the rights to the headwaters that fed the valley's creeks when others were still dreaming of ore. Now, at 33, he ran 1,000 head of cattle and was a man of substance. He was known to be hard, demanding a full day's work for a day's wage, but it was also said that his word was as solid as the granite peaks that shadowed his land. He kept to himself, a solitary figure whose past as a Union scout was rumored but never discussed. A different kind of power was making its presence felt in the valley that summer. The railroad was coming, a promise of progress that carried the threat of change like a rumble of distant thunder. With the iron rails came speculators and contractors, men with soft hands and hard eyes. The most powerful of them was Ezra Pike, a man who spoke of civic betterment while his agents moved quietly among the smaller homesteads, acquiring land and, more importantly, water rights. The law was a distant, clumsy thing in this part of the territory, easily bent by money and influence. Pike was a patient predator, and the valley was his hunting ground. The summer heat had baked the valley for weeks, turning the earth to brick. Then, one afternoon, the sky turned the color of a deep bruise. The storm did not arrive with a gentle warning. It fell upon the mountains with a sudden, terrible violence. Rain came down, not in drops, but in sheets, and the dry arroyo swelled into roaring, muddy torrents. At the Hart homestead, the ditch that carried their lifeblood from the creek, a ditch Ephraim Hart had dug with his own 2 hands, could not hold. Eliza and her parents watched from the cabin door as the earthen berm groaned, sagged, and then dissolved. A wall of brown water, thick with silt and debris, surged across their corn patch, tearing at the roots and scouring the topsoil. In the chaos, Ephraim lunged to save a crate of seed potatoes from being swept away. A stray log, churning in the current, caught him, spinning him around and slamming his hand against the cabin's foundation. He cried out, a sharp, choked sound. When the worst of the flood had passed, leaving behind a field of ruin and a thick blanket of red mud, they saw the damage. The ditch was gone. Their crop was lost, and Ephraim's hand was a mangled, swollen mess, 2 fingers clearly broken. Worse still, the small wooden box where he kept his papers, including the ledger detailing their debt, had been washed from its shelf. They found it snagged in a thicket of willow, its contents a pulpy, illegible ruin. The debt was not gone, only its record, and in its absence, it felt larger and more monstrous than before. There was no choice. With her father groaning in his cot, his hand clumsily splinted, and her mother weeping softly by the cold stove. Eliza made a decision. She saddled their mule, Patience, a creature as stubborn and enduring as its name suggested, and set out for town to find a doctor and beg for help, for credit, for anything. The air after the storm was unnaturally cool and heavy with the smell of wet earth. The road was a treacherous track of mud and washouts. As she rounded a bend where the trail skirted a wide, marshy flat, she found her way blocked. 3 men on horseback sat their mounts, talking to a homesteader whose wagon was mired to its axles in the muck. Eliza recognized them as the sort of men who drifted from ranch to ranch, never staying long. Their skills suited more to persuasion with a rope's end than a branding iron. They worked for Pike. Everyone knew it. They were his grass cutters, men who cleared the way. "All we're saying, Henderson," one of the men said, his voice carrying on the still air, "is Mr. Pike is making a generous offer. He'll take that worthless patch off your hands, pay you a fair price, considering the flood and all. But my water rights go with it," the homesteader pleaded. "It ain't worthless if I got water." "You ain't got water right now, do you?" another man countered, gesturing with his thumb at the broken ditch that paralleled the road. "Looks like your water is spread all over creation. Mr. Pike's offer is for today. Might not be there tomorrow." Eliza tried to guide Patience around the group, her face averted, her heart pounding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. A young woman, alone, was a vulnerable thing. Her honor was a currency more valuable than gold, and far easier to lose. But the third rider, a lean man with a cruel twist to his mouth, nudged his horse into her path. "Well now, look what the flood washed up. You lost, little lady." Eliza kept her eyes fixed on the mule's ears. "I'm on my way to Dry Creek, sir." "In a powerful hurry," the man observed, his eyes roving over her simple, mud-splattered dress. "Maybe you got a ditch that needs fixin', mister. Pike is helping folks out, for a price." Fear, cold and sharp, pricked at her. This was how it was done. Not with guns drawn, but with helpful offers that were really threats. With a smile that showed too many teeth. She was trapped. Then, another rider appeared, coming down the trail from the direction of the high country. He was a big man on a powerful bay horse, and he moved with a quiet authority that silenced the conversation. It was Cole Sullivan. He halted his horse a few yards away, his gaze taking in the scene without expression. His face was weathered, browned by the sun, and his eyes were the pale, clear gray of a winter sky. "She's on her way to town," Sullivan said. His voice was not loud, but it cut through the heavy air. "Let her pass." The lean rider bristled. "This ain't your concern, Sullivan." "This is my range," Cole replied, his voice flat and final. "Everything on it is my concern. Your business with Henderson is one thing. Your business with this young woman is over." He did not raise his voice. He did not reach for the pistol on his hip. He simply waited, and the force of his stillness was more menacing than any threat. The 3 men exchanged uneasy glances. They were Pike's men. But Cole Sullivan was a different sort of problem. He was a landowner, a man with his own crew, and a reputation for finishing what he started. After a tense moment, the lean rider spat a stream of tobacco juice into the mud and pulled his horse aside. Eliza urged Patience forward, her cheeks burning with a mixture of shame and relief. She did not look at her rescuer. As she passed, Cole Sullivan fell in beside her, his big bay easily keeping pace with the mule. "Your family is the Harts, aren't you?" he asked, his eyes on the trail ahead. "Up on the South Fork." "Yes, sir," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Ditch break." She nodded, unable to speak past the lump in her throat. "Your father, his hand is broken. The flood." Her voice trailed off. They rode in silence for a time. The path back to her homestead was impassable, and the way to town was blocked by Pike's men. Cole seemed to be weighing this in his mind. There's a line cabin of mine a mile from here, he said finally, as if coming to a decision. Near the swamp. It's dry. You can wait there. I'll send one of my men to fetch the doctor for your father and see to your folks. Eliza's head shot up, her eyes wide with alarm. Stay in a strange man's cabin alone. The thought sent a fresh wave of fear through her. The gossip would be merciless. Her reputation, so carefully protected, would be ruined. Oh, I couldn't. Sir, it wouldn't be proper. Proper has very little to do with a broken ditch and a busted hand. Miss Hart, he said, his tone not unkind. It's that, or you sit here in the mud until Pike's men get tired of plaguing Henderson. The cabin is your best choice. He was right. The logic of survival was stark and stripped of niceties, with a sense of dread. She nodded her assent. He led her off the main trail, onto a smaller track that wound toward a grove of cottonwoods. The cabin was small, sturdy, and smelled of wood smoke and old leather. He dismounted, tied the horses, and pushed open the door. There's coffee in the tin and dried beef in the sack. The bunk is clean. He stood on the threshold, a large and imposing figure, careful not to cross it. He was giving her the space, creating a boundary she so desperately needed. I'll go see to your family. I will bar the door from the outside. No one will bother you. He was a stranger, and she was in his debt, a position she despised. Yet, in his straightforward, respectful manner, she found a small measure of comfort. He was a man of his word. The valley said so. Left alone, she sank onto a three-legged stool, the tension of the day overwhelming her. Nature had tried to crush them, and now men were circling to pick at the pieces. She was afraid, not just of Ezra Pike and his schemes, but of the compromise she had just made, trading a piece of her carefully guarded propriety for a stranger's protection. It was nearly dusk when Cole Sullivan returned. He did not enter the cabin, but spoke to her through the door. The doctor is on his way to your father. My men have shored up what's left of your cabin's foundation and brought your folks a hot meal. They are safe. He paused, and when he spoke again, his voice was different, quieter. Your mother gave me this. Thought you'd want it safe. He passed the ruined, pulpy ledger through a crack in the door. Eliza took it, her hands trembling. It was their shame, their failure, made tangible. Thank you, she said, her voice small. Miss Hart, he said, his voice still low. I spread the pages out to dry as best I could. He hesitated. I'm not a lawyer, but I know a bit about contracts. The seal on the bottom of your note. It's from Ezra Pike's attorney in Denver. Eliza looked up from the ruined paper, her eyes meeting his through the opening. The setting sun cast long shadows, but she could see the grim set of his jaw. This flood didn't create your problem, Cole Sullivan said, his voice as hard and cold as river stone. It only brought it to a head. You and your father were caught in a trap long before the first drop of rain fell. The pale light of dawn was filtering through the cracks in the cabin walls when Cole Sullivan returned. Eliza was already awake, having spent a fitful night on the hard bunk, the ruined ledger a tangible weight beside her. She stood as he unbarred the door, her back straight, her expression carefully neutral. He held out a tin cup of coffee, the steam rising in the cool morning air. She took it, the warmth a small comfort against the chill of her anxiety. Your father's hand is set, Cole said, his voice a low rumble. The doctor says he'll be clumsy for a while, but the bones should mend clean. I left 2 of my men there to clear the worst of the silt from your field. Eliza took a sip of the strong, bitter coffee. We can't pay you for their time, Mr. Sullivan. We have no cash. Her voice was stiff with the shame of admitting it. He looked past her, his gaze fixed on the distant mountains. I'm not asking for cash, but I have a need, and you have a skill. He brought his eyes back to hers, and they were direct, unblinking. The flood took out a section of my own ditch further up. I'm pulling men off the branding crew to rebuild the embankment. It's 10 days hard work, maybe more. Those men will need to be fed. My regular cook is a drunk who is currently sobering up in the town jail." He paused, letting the offer settle in the small space between them. "I will send my men and my scraper to your property. They will rebuild your ditch, stronger than it was before. In exchange, you will come to the Twin Spurs and cook for my crew for 10 days. Eliza's heart sank. To go to his ranch, a place run by men, without a female chaperone was unthinkable. The whispers would follow her like shadows, staining her name, and a good name was all a poor woman truly possessed. It was a devil's bargain, her family's survival for her reputation. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "I am grateful for your help, but I cannot. It would not be right." "Right has nothing to do with it, Miss Hart," he countered, his tone hardening just enough to show his impatience with convention. "Pike's men are offering your neighbors pennies on the dollar for their land because their ditches are broken and their spirit is low. This is about survival. I am offering you a way to pay a debt with your own labor, to stand on your own feet. There is more honor in that than in anything the gossips in town can take from you." She saw the truth in his words, as hard and unyielding as the land itself. He was offering a trade, not charity, an exchange of work for work. It was a kind of justice she understood. She lifted her chin, her resolve hardening. If she was to do this, it would be on her terms. "I accept," she said, her voice clear and steady now. "With conditions. I will have my own quarters, separate from the men. I will take my meals alone, after the crew has eaten, and I will be finished with my duties and have my door closed by sunset each evening." A flicker of something surprise, perhaps respect, showed in his eyes. "That seems fair," he said with a slow nod. "It will be as you say." The Twin Spurs Ranch was not a homestead. It was an enterprise. The main house was built of solid timber, flanked by a long, low bunkhouse, a blacksmith's shop, and a series of sturdy corrals that stretched down toward the creek. It was a place of order and purpose, everything shaped by the singular will of the man who owned it. At the center of the dusty yard stood the source of it all, a deep well, capped with an iron pump. Its tall handle, worn smooth by countless hands, stood like a scepter. It was the heart of the ranch, the symbol of the water that gave Cole Sullivan his power. It was the source of life. Her first full day was a blur of hard work. She was given a small, clean room off the back of the main house, and the kitchen was larger and better stocked than any she had ever seen. She baked bread, stewed a side of beef with potatoes and onions, and made a pot of coffee strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe. The men, a rough crew of a dozen riders, were hesitant at first, unused to a woman's presence in the cookhouse. They came in from their work on the ditch, dusty and sweat-stained, and ate in a near silence, their praise for her cooking mumbled into their plates. True to his word, Cole Sullivan ensured her conditions were met. She ate her own simple meal in the quiet of the kitchen, the work of the day done, and retired to her room as the sun bled its last orange and purple across the western sky. By the third day, her supplies were running low. Cole gave her a list and a line of credit at the general store in Dry Creek, riding in on patience, with the Twin Spurs brand on the saddle blanket. She felt 100 eyes on her. The town was buzzing with news of the flood and, it seemed, with news of her. As she stood at the counter waiting for the storekeeper to tally her goods, flour, salt, beans, coffee, she became aware of the lowered voices from the corner where the Ladies' Aid Society was gathered. "A daughter of Ephraim Hart, the Quaker." A woman's voice drifted, sharp as a needle. "Staying out at the Sullivan place, all alone." "It's a scandal," another voice added, dripping with sanctimonious pity. Her poor mother must be beside herself. A girl with no prospects cannot afford to be careless with her virtue. Eliza felt the heat rise in her face. She wanted to turn, to tell them of her father's injury, of the ruined ditch, of the fair bargain she had struck. But she knew it would be useless. Their minds were made up. their judgments passed. She was a woman unchaperoned at a man's ranch, and in their world, there was only one reason for that. She kept her back to them, her spine rigid, and focused on the methodical thump of the storekeeper's pencil on his tablet. "That's a considerable order, Miss Hart," a smooth voice said from beside her. She turned to see a man she did not know. He was handsome in a way that was foreign to the valley, dressed in a tailored suit and polished boots. His smile was pleasant, but his eyes were shrewd, assessing. "My name is Ezra Pike," he said, tipping his hat. "I am the chief contractor for the new rail line. I was so sorry to hear of the troubles the flood has brought to so many fine people in this valley, including your own family." Eliza stiffened. This was the man whose name Cole Sullivan had spoken with such contempt, the wolf in a fine suit. "We are managing—" "Thank you," she said coolly. Of course," Pike said, his smile never wavering. "But these are difficult times. A man like your father, injured and facing ruin, might be forced to make difficult decisions. I want you to know, I am not like the other speculators. I am here to build a community. I would be willing to extend your family a private loan at a most favorable rate of interest to see you through this trouble. All I would ask for as collateral is a temporary lien on your water rights, just until the loan is repaid." It was a silken trap, offered with a benevolent air. He was using the law, the language of finance, as his weapon. He saw her desperation and sought to exploit it, dressing his greed in the guise of charity. He was offering to save them with the very water he intended to steal. "My father handles our business, Mr. Pike," Eliza said, her voice firm, "and we are not in need of a loan. Good day." She paid for her supplies, her hands steady despite the anger churning within her. She walked out of the store, head held high, and loaded her goods onto the mule, acutely aware of Pike's watchful eyes and the renewed whispering of the women. The ride back to the Twin Spurs was long and lonely, the injustice of it all a bitter taste in her mouth. She was caught in a vice on one side, the harsh judgment of a society that demanded she remain helpless and pure. On the other, the predatory manipulations of a powerful man. Cole Sullivan's offer, a simple contract of labor for labor, seemed the only clean thing in a dirty world. That evening, Cole returned late from a trip to the county seat. He was in a grim mood, his face set in hard lines. He ate his supper standing in the kitchen. A habit Eliza was coming to learn meant his mind was troubled. He did not speak of his trip. But later, as she was cleaning up, she saw a light burning in the small office he kept in the main house. He had gone to see the mayor, a man named Sterling, a pompous fool who was easily flattered. Cole had spoken of beef contracts, of the influx of workers the railroad would bring, and Sterling had puffed up like a toad, eager to show his importance. He had boasted of his close relationship with Mr. Pike, of the great progress coming to their valley. To prove his point, he had unrolled a map across his desk, a survey of the proposed route for the new rail spur. "Pike gave this to me himself," Sterling had declared, tapping a manicured finger on the parchment. "A gesture of his confidence in our town's leadership." Cole had feigned polite interest, but his eyes had traced the lines on the map with a growing sense of cold dread. The main line was to pass north of Dry Creek, as everyone knew. But the spur, the one meant to service the town, took a curious and deliberate turn. It cut directly across the upper meadows, right through the very headwaters of the creek that fed the southern end of the valley. The creek that supplied water to a dozen small homesteads. The creek that fed the ditch that the Harts, and others like them, depended on for their very lives. Now, sitting in his office, the image of that map was burned into his mind. Pike's plan was as devious as it was simple. He wasn't just buying up water rights with predatory loans. He was planning to cut the water off at its source. The railroad, that great engine of progress, was his instrument. He would create a drought by design, And when the homesteaders were truly broken, their fields turned to dust. He would acquire their land and their water for nothing. The mayor was either a fool or a willing accomplice, bribed by Pike's promises of prosperity. Pike's legal traps, like the one he'd set for the Hearts, were just the first step. The map was the blueprint for the final blow. Cole stared out the window into the darkness, at the vast, silent land under his protection. A quiet fury built in him. The law was being twisted into a weapon against the very people it was meant to protect. Justice, he knew, would not simply arrive on the morning stage. If there was to be any justice in this valley, someone would have to stand up and make a claim for it. He thought of Eliza Hart, of her quiet pride and fierce integrity in the face of gossip and veiled threats. He thought of her father's broken hand and the ruined ledger. This was bigger than one family's troubles. This was a fight for the life of the valley itself. For a week, a tense, watchful quiet had settled over the twin spurs. The work of rebuilding the Hart's ditch and shoring up Cole's own embankment continued under a sun that seemed to grow hotter and more merciless each day. The air grew thin and dry, charged with a strange electricity. The sky, once a brilliant, endless blue, took on a hazy, brassy quality. At night, Eliza would stand for a moment outside her door, listening to the incessant rasp of the crickets and feeling the oppressive warmth that refused to dissipate even after dark. It was a weather that set a man's teeth on edge, a silence that felt like a held breath. The storm, when it came, was a cheat. It announced itself with a flicker of silent lightning in the high peaks, a ghostly dance that promised the relief of rain. But the clouds that gathered were high and wispy, and they brought no moisture. They brought only wind, a hot, gusting gale that smelled of dust and ozone, and a barrage of dry lightning that stabbed at the parched ridges surrounding the valley. Eliza was kneading dough for the next morning's bread when the first great clap of thunder rattled the windows of the cookhouse. It was a sound less like thunder and more like a giant splitting a mountain of granite. She glanced outside. The sky was a terrifying spectacle of black and bruised purple, shot through with veins of white-hot light. Then, a cry went up from one of the hands who had been watching from the porch of the bunkhouse. Fire on the ridge. Eliza rushed to the door. High above them, on the spine of the juniper-choked ridge that formed the western wall of the ranch, a single tree had exploded into a torch. The wind caught the flames immediately, and the single torch became a line. The line a sheet of incandescent orange that began to crawl with an unnatural speed down the mountainside, feeding on the dry timber. The ranch bell began to clang, its frantic metallic voice a call to arms against an ancient enemy. The orderly routine of the twin spurs dissolved into a controlled chaos orchestrated by Cole Sullivan's sharp, clear commands. He seemed to be everywhere at once, his voice cutting through the rising roar of the fire and the howl of the wind. Soak the roof's bunkhouse first, then the main house, Billy. You and Sam get the wagon teams harnessed. We'll need water barrels. The rest of you, grab shovels, axes, anything that will cut sod. We'll make our stand at the creek bed. The men moved with the grim efficiency of those who understood the stakes. This was not a fight they could win. It was a battle to survive. The fire was a living thing now, a ravenous beast of heat and light, and it was coming for them. Eliza stood frozen for only a second, the raw terror of the sight threatening to paralyze her. But the habits of a lifetime of duty, of work, of finding her place in a crisis took over. The men fighting the fire would need water. They would need strength. Her place was here. She turned back into the kitchen, her fear channeled into a focused, furious energy. She put the massive coffee pot on to boil. She found the largest tin buckets and filled them with water from the pump, her arms straining with the weight. She called to the two young boys who helped her peel potatoes and chop wood. "We need to help," she said, her voice calm and steady, a surprising anchor in the storm of noise. "We will carry water to the men, and we will make noise, lots of noise." She handed each of them a large stew pot and a metal spoon. She took a heavy cast-iron skillet for herself. As the first of the men ran past, their faces grim. Heading for the creek bed a quarter-mile distant, she and the boys stepped out into the yard. They began to beat the pots and pans, a desperate, rhythmic clangor that was half alarm, half prayer. It was a defiant din against the roaring silence of the flames, a human sound to assert they were still there, still fighting. The heat rolled down from the ridge in waves. The air grew thick and acrid, filled with smoke that stung the eyes and choked the lungs. Embers, carried on the wind, began to fall like a rain of malevolent fireflies, hissing as they landed on the wetted canvas roofs. Eliza and the boys scurried back and forth, dousing the small sparks that threatened to ignite the outbuildings. Then, forming a small brigade, they began hauling buckets of water out toward the line of men digging frantically at the earth. She could see Cole, a silhouette against the terrifying orange glow. Directing the work, he was not digging himself, but moving along the line, his presence a steadying force, pointing out where to deepen the trench, where to clear the brush. The men worked like demons, their shovels rising and falling, their faces black with soot, their bodies slick with sweat. Eliza would leave a bucket and retreat, her lungs burning, only to return with another. The fire was closer now, a wall of sound and fury. The roar was constant, punctuated by the sharp crack of exploding trees. She could feel the heat on her face, tightening the skin. Thirst was a physical pain in her throat. Each breath was an effort. The world was reduced to the fire, the smoke, the desperate clang of shovels, and the rhythmic, defiant beat of her skillet. She was no longer Eliza Hart, the Quaker's daughter, concerned with propriety and reputation. She was a woman fighting for a piece of ground, for the lives of the people who stood upon it. The night wore on, an eternity of heat and exhaustion. The fire reached the creek bed, the line the men had scraped from the earth. It paused there, hungry, licking at the cleared ground. For a terrifying hour, the battle hung in the balance. The wind would gust, sending tongues of flame leaping across the break, and the men would beat them out with wet sacks and shovels. Then, as if a great hand had intervened, the wind shifted. It turned back on itself, pushing the fire away from the ranch, up toward the bare, rocky scree of the highest peaks where it would find no more fuel. The immediate danger had passed. The roaring faded, replaced by the crackle and hiss of cooling embers and the ragged, gasping breaths of the exhausted men. Dawn broke upon a scene of devastation. The entire ridge was a blackened, skeletal forest, still smoking under a sky the color of ash. The air was thick and tasted of soot. The ranch itself, miraculously, was safe. The wetted roofs had held, but the wind had been fickle. A small, detached shed that stood apart from the main buildings, used to store salt and flour and other dry goods, had been caught by a swirl of embers. It was now a heap of charred timbers and smoking ruin. The men collapsed where they stood, too tired to speak, their faces masks of soot and grime. Eliza, her own face streaked with black, her dress scorched and torn, went back to the kitchen. She brewed more coffee, sliced the bread she'd been making what seemed a lifetime ago, and set out plates of cold beef. She moved among the men, her exhaustion a heavy weight in her limbs, handing out food and drink. They took it with mumbled words of thanks, their eyes hollow with fatigue. One of the younger hands, a boy named Tom, no older than 17, was trying to wrap a bleeding gash on his forearm with a dirty bandana. An axe had slipped in the smoke-filled darkness. Eliza stopped beside him. "Let me see that," she said gently. He unwrapped the makeshift bandage, revealing a deep, ragged cut. Without a word, she went back to the house and returned with a bowl of clean, hot water, soap, and her sewing kit. She knelt in the dirt beside him and began to clean the wound, her touch firm and sure. The boy winced but held still. Then, with small, precise stitches, using the finest needle and whitest thread she possessed, she began to close the wound. Cole Sullivan stood a short distance away, watching. He had seen her command the kitchen, seen her rally the boys to beat the pans, seen her haul water until she nearly dropped. Now he saw this other side of her, this quiet competence, this gentle, healing strength. In the midst of the soot and ruin, her steady hands were an act of restoration, of putting things back together. She was more than a cook, more than a bargain he had struck. She was a woman of substance, as strong and resilient as the land itself. When she was finished, she bandaged the arm with a strip of clean cloth torn from a petticoat. She looked up and met Cole's gaze. The space between them, once filled with the formal distance of their arrangement, was now charged with a new, unspoken understanding. They had faced the fire together, and it had burned away the pretense. "Thank you, Miss Hart," he said, his voice rough with smoke and fatigue. She simply nodded, too tired for words, and moved on to offer another man a cup of coffee. Later that morning, after the men had eaten and collapsed into their bunks, Cole walked out to the remains of the burned supplies shed. The loss was a blow. Flour and salt were essential, and replacing them would be costly. He kicked at a charred beam, the ashes puffing up in a gray cloud. Something metallic glinted in the debris. He bent down and pulled a small, scorched tin box from the wreckage. It was a lockbox, the kind used for holding papers. It must have been tucked away on a high shelf. He pried the heat-warped lid open. Inside, most of the contents were burned to black flakes, but one piece of paper, folded in the center, had been protected. It was singed around the edges, the writing on it clear in the gray morning light. It was not a bill of lading or a receipt. It was a note, written in a precise, educated hand. The message was short, and it made the blood run cold in his veins. "Yield your water rights," it said, "and the railroad will be sure to avoid your ranch." Cole stared at the words, the acrid smell of the fire filling his lungs. This was no accident of nature. The lightning strike may have been real, but the fire swift. Relentless path toward his ranch now seemed terrifyingly deliberate. This note was a message from Pike, a threat delivered by fire. The game had changed. Pike was no longer content with legal tricks and financial pressure. He was willing to burn a man out to get what he wanted. Cole slowly crushed the singed paper in his fist. The ashes on the ground around him were a symbol. He realized, not just of what was lost, but of the scorched earth fight that was to come. The smoke lingered in the valley for days, a hazy reminder of their vulnerability. It was a shroud that muted the sharp edges of the mountains and made the sun a pale, distant coin in the sky. The fire had been a brute force of nature, but the scorched note Cole Sullivan kept tucked in his shirt pocket was a testament to the cold malice of man. He knew then that waiting for the law to find its way to Dry Creek was a fool's hope. They had to make their own law, build their own fortress. He sent riders to every homestead and small ranch within a day's ride, calling for a meeting at the Twin Spurs. They came, a dozen hard-bitten men, their faces etched with the same worry Cole felt in his own gut. They were independent by nature, distrustful of alliances, each man accustomed to fighting his own battles. They gathered in the main barn, the air thick with the smell of hay, leather, and nervous sweat, their skepticism a palpable force. Cole stood before them, not on a platform, but on the same packed earth floor, his boots dusty like theirs. He laid out the situation with the blunt economy of a man who did not waste words. He spoke of the flood, of Pike's agents preying on the desperate. He spoke of the fire, and then he unfolded the scorched note and read the 7 words aloud. A low, angry murmur went through the barn. "Pike isn't just trying to buy us out," Cole concluded, his voice low and steady. "He's trying to break us, one by one. He's betting we're too stubborn and too proud to stand together. I say we prove him wrong." He proposed his plan, the Dry Creek Water Alliance, a pact for mutual survival. Each rancher would contribute to a common fund for supplies. They would build a central, well-guarded depot for food and equipment, a fortress against both fire and starvation. They would establish a system of smoke signals, a way to call for help that was faster than a horse. An old rancher named Peterson, his face a leather mask of doubt, spat a stream of tobacco. And who's gonna run this depot? Sullivan. Who's gonna keep track of who gives what and who takes what? That's a job for a clerk, not a cowhand. Cole had anticipated the question. His gaze moved to the doorway of the barn, where Eliza stood, having just brought a tray of tin cups and a fresh pot of coffee. She had not been invited, but she had known the meeting was vital, and that men with dry throats made poor decisions. "Miss Hart will do it," Cole announced. The barn went silent. The men stared, first at Cole, then at Eliza. To place a woman, a young, unmarried woman, in a position of such trust and authority was unheard of. It flew in the face of every convention. Eliza herself was stunned, her hand frozen on the handle of the coffee pot. The heat rose in her cheeks, the familiar flush of being made the center of attention. She is honest, she is organized, and she has a better head for figures than any man here, Cole continued, his voice daring any of them to challenge him. She has already proven her courage. She will be the coordinator of our alliance. She will answer to all of us. He was not asking them, he was telling them, but he was also giving her a choice. His eyes met hers across the dusty space, and in them she saw not a command, but a question. It was a public declaration of his respect, a shield against the very gossip he knew had wounded her. He was offering her a chance to turn the whispers into words of grudging admiration, to earn her place not through a man's protection, but through her own capability. She thought of the women in the general store, their faces pinched with judgment. She lifted her chin. "I will," she said, her voice clear and carrying to the back of the barn. "I will keep the books, and I expect them to be balanced to the penny." A few of the men grunted, a sound that was part surprise, part assent. The matter was settled. The alliance was born, and Eliza Hart, the Quaker's daughter, was its unexpected quartermaster. In the days that followed, a new energy took hold. Supplies were pooled. A small, defensible stone outbuilding on Cole's property was designated as the common depot. Eliza, working at a rough-hewn table, created her ledger, her neat, precise script, a stark contrast to the rough-hewn world she now helped to manage. Being near Cole Sullivan every day was a complicated thing. A quiet current of awareness flowed between them, born in the shared terror of the fire. Yet he never crossed the boundaries she had set. He treated her with a formal respect that was, in its way, more intimate than any casual familiarity. She found herself watching him, admiring the quiet authority with which he moved, the fairness he showed his men, the deep, abiding connection he had to the land. A dangerous question began to form in the quiet of her mind. Was this feeling growing in her heart a true and independent thing, or was it merely the gratitude of a person rescued? A vine clinging to the strongest tree in the forest. She feared losing herself, her own choices, in the shadow of his strength. The first test of the alliance came sooner than anyone expected. One of Cole's men, riding fence near a remote spring used to water the herds, found new strands of barbed wire strung tight across the access point. It was a bold move, a direct claim on a communal water source. Cole and 3 other ranchers rode out to investigate. As they approached, they saw a lone figure working with a set of fence pliers. It was Mac Doyle, the lean, cruel-mouthed rider who had accosted Eliza on the road after the flood, the acknowledged leader of Pike's crew of grass cutters. They took him by surprise. There was a short, sharp struggle, and Doyle was disarmed and bound. When they searched his saddlebags, they found not just more wire, but a small, leather-bound book. It was a ledger, just like the one Eliza kept, But Doyle's book detailed payments, sums of money paid out to various men for discouraging homesteaders, for disputing claims, for securing access. Ezra Pike's name appeared at the top of every page. They brought Doyle back to the Twin Spurs, his hands tied to the saddle horn. The news spread quickly. By evening, the men of the Alliance had gathered again. They were a grim, angry assembly. The official law was in the pocket of Mayor Sterling, who was in the pocket of Pike. To turn Doyle over to the town marshal would be to set him free. "We'll hold our own court," Peterson declared, his voice a low growl. "A prairie trial." It was a frontier necessity, a form of justice as old as the mountains. When the law failed, men made their own. They formed a jury of 12, a collection of ranchers and homesteaders. Cole Sullivan was nominated to act as judge, to keep the proceedings orderly. Doyle was tied to a chair in the middle of the barn. The light from a dozen lanterns cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, turning the familiar space into a makeshift courtroom. Eliza's role was to feed them. As the men deliberated, she worked in the cookhouse, preparing a meal of beef stew and cornbread. It felt strange to be performing such a domestic, ordinary task while a man's fate was being decided 100 yards away. Yet she understood its importance. She was feeding the body of their new community, giving them the strength to carry out this hard, necessary business. The trial was short and direct. The evidence was presented the wire, the ledger, Doyle, seeing the ring of determined, unsympathetic faces, and likely imagining the feel of a rope, lost his swagger. He confessed. He admitted he and his men worked for Pike. He admitted the ledger was a record of their payments for intimidating and harassing anyone who stood in Pike's way. "Pike wants the water," Doyle said, his voice raspy. "All of it. He aims to own this whole valley." A verdict was reached in minutes. Guilty. The sentence was not death, but banishment. He would be escorted to the edge of the territory and warned never to return, under penalty of death. It was a just and fitting sentence. But as two men moved to untie him, a horse and buggy clattered into the ranch yard at high speed. Mayor Sterling, his face red and puffed with indignation, stormed into the barn, flanked by the town marshal. "What is the meaning of this outrage?" Sterling boomed. "You are holding this man against his will. This is vigilantism. I demand you release Mr. Doyle into the custody of the law at once." Cole stepped forward. "We have evidence. Mayor, a signed confession, a ledger of payments from Ezra Pike." "Fabrications." Sterling sputtered. "This is a conspiracy by a pack of ruffians to besmirch the name of a respected businessman. Release him now, or I will have the U.S. Marshals here by the end of the week to arrest every last one of you for kidnapping." The threat hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. The ranchers were strong, but they could not fight the federal government. The law, however twisted and corrupt, still held the ultimate power, with a sense of bitter defeat. Cole gave the order to release Doyle. Mac Doyle walked free, a smirk on his face, and climbed into the buggy beside the mayor. They rode off into the night, leaving the men of the Alliance in a state of angry, impotent silence. The sense of failure was a bitter pill. Eliza cleaned up the kitchen, her heart heavy. The men had dispersed, muttering curses. Justice had been within their grasp, and it had been snatched away. Cole was in his office, going over the papers they had taken from Doyle. Later, he brought out the sodden, ruined papers from her own family's ledger, which he had kept, hoping some part of it might one day be useful. He laid the fragile, water-stained pages out on the kitchen table under the lamplight, trying to piece together anything that might help. Eliza came to stand beside him, looking down at the wreckage of her family's finances. One small piece of paper, a receipt of some kind, was more intact than the others. A single line of writing was clear, followed by a signature. She recognized the shaky, uncertain script immediately. It was the signature of a man writing with his uninjured hand, a man in pain, It was her father's signature. The words on the receipt swam before her eyes. Received the sum of $50 in exchange for a temporary transfer of water rights pending debt settlement. The date was from just after the flood. Her father, in his pain and desperation, had been tricked. Pike's men had not come with threats, but with a small sum of cash and a complex document he couldn't properly read or understand. He had signed away their water, their future, for a pittance. A cold dread washed over her, more chilling than the night of the fire. The enemy was not just outside the gates. A breach had been made from within, through her own father's moment of weakness and despair. The fight for the valley was no longer just a matter of community. It had just become deeply, painfully personal. She had to reclaim not just their water, but her family's honor. From the lie her father had been forced to sign, the discovery of her father's signature on the water receipt was a quiet, devastating blow. It was not a betrayal born of malice, but of weakness, which in some ways felt worse. It was the mark of a good man brought low by pain and fear, a man who had faltered under the immense pressure of his world collapsing. Eliza felt a pang of profound pity for him, followed by a cold wave of resolve. The shame was not just his. It was the family's, and the responsibility to reclaim their honor now fell squarely on her shoulders. The 10-day bargain she had made with Cole Sullivan was nearly complete. Soon, she would be expected to return to her family's broken homestead, her debt of labor paid. But she knew she could not leave. To leave now would be to abandon the fight, to accept the crooked signature as their final word. She had to stay, but she would not stay as a charity case or as a woman in need of protection. She would stay as a woman of purpose. She would take control of the only thing she had to offer: her skill, her labor, her unwavering capacity for work. She would repay the debt her father had incurred, and in doing so, she would begin to repair the tear in her family's name. The next morning, she sought out Cole. He was by the corral, checking the cinch on his saddle, the early light casting his face in sharp relief. She stood a respectful distance away until he looked up and acknowledged her with a nod. "Mr. Sullivan," she began, her voice even. "Our 10 days are concluded. Your ditch is repaired, as is ours. My debt to you is paid." He finished his knot and turned to face her fully. "It is. Miss Hart, you are free to return to your family." "I cannot," she said simply. "My father, in his distress, made a bargain with Pike's men. He signed away our water. That is a debt that is not yet paid." She paused, gathering her strength. "I wish to continue my work here, not for the whole crew, but for you and your foreman. I will cook your evening meal. I will keep the main house clean. I will continue to manage the Alliance Depot. In exchange, I ask for nothing but room and board, and your continued counsel in this fight against Mr. Pike." It was a bold proposal. She was offering to embed herself in the very heart of his operation, to make herself indispensable. She was not asking for wages, which would make her a servant, but for a place at the center of the conflict, which would make her an ally. Cole studied her for a long moment, his gray eyes searching her face. He saw the pride there, the unbending will. He saw that she was not asking for a handout, but demanding a foothold. He gave a single, decisive nod. "As you wish, Miss Hart." And so, a new routine began. Each afternoon, Eliza moved from the rough-and-tumble bunkhouse kitchen to the larger, quieter kitchen of the main house. She no longer cooked in massive quantities for a dozen hungry men. Instead, she prepared one meal, with care and precision, for 4 Cole and his 3 senior foremen. It was a supper that marked the end of the day's strategic planning, the council of war against Ezra Pike. She performed this new duty in a state of self-imposed silence. It was a silence born not of shyness or fear, but of profound concentration. It was a shield. In a world where a woman's words could be so easily twisted, where her reputation was so fragile, her silence became her armor. She did not engage in small talk. She did not offer opinions on the ranch's affairs unless asked directly about the depot's supplies. She worked with a focused, graceful efficiency that was its own form of communication. Her hands, wiping down the long wooden table, were saying, "I create order here." The savory scent of her beef and barley stew was saying, "I provide sustenance." The warm glow of the clean lamp chimney was saying, "I offer a place of peace in a time of war." The men, including Cole, learned to respect it. They would come in from their meetings, their faces grim with the day's troubles, and the quiet, orderly warmth of the kitchen would seem to soothe them. They spoke in lower voices. They thanked her for the meal, and she would respond with a simple, quiet nod. The evening meal became a ritual, a silent sacrament that fortified them for the struggle to come. Each plate she served was a small act of defiance, a testament to the endurance of ordinary life in the face of extraordinary threats. Inwardly, however, Eliza was anything but silent. Her mind was a torrent of conflicting emotions. Each day spent in Cole Sullivan's presence was a trial for her heart. She saw the immense burden he carried, the weight of the entire valley's future resting on his broad shoulders. She saw his fundamental decency, his unwavering commitment to a justice that seemed to be slipping further away with each new maneuver by Pike. A deep and powerful affection was growing within her, an emotion that both thrilled and terrified her. She was afraid of what it meant. Was this love, or was it merely dependence? He had saved her from Doyle, given her family a lifeline, and treated her with a respect she had never known from another man. It would be so easy to mistake gratitude for love, to let her identity be subsumed by his. She fought against it, fiercely guarding her own counsel, reminding herself that she was Eliza Hart, a woman with her own battle to fight, her own honor to restore. She could not, would not, become a mere appendage to his life, a woman who existed only in his shadow. One evening, the strain was greater than usual. A rancher from the north end of the valley, his nerve broken, had sold his land and water rights to Pike for a fraction of their worth. The alliance had lost a piece of its front line. The mood among Cole and his foreman during their meeting had been tense, their voices carrying from the office, sharp with frustration. When they came into the kitchen for their meal, the silence was heavy and grim. They ate quickly, their thoughts elsewhere, and left as soon as they were finished, leaving Cole alone at the head of the table, staring into his empty coffee cup. Eliza moved about the room, clearing the plates, her movements quiet and deliberate. The smell of the rich beef stew and fresh cornbread still hung in the warm air. The oil lamp on the table cast a soft, golden glow, a small circle of light in the growing darkness. Cole did not move. He just sat there, watching her. He wasn't looking at her with desire, or even with particular interest. He was simply watching her move through the familiar, comforting routine, as if her quiet, predictable actions were the only solid thing in a world that was coming undone. She finished her work, wiping down the stovetop until it shone. She untied her apron and hung it on its hook. The evening was over. Her duties were done. As she turned to walk to her own small room, she passed by his chair. He did not speak, but he reached out and gently took her hand. His grip was not possessive or demanding. It was a simple, human touch. His large, calloused hand enveloping hers. He stood, still holding her hand, and turned it over. He looked down at her palm, at the faint scars and calluses from a lifetime of work. Then he lowered his head and pressed his lips to the back of her hand. It was a gesture of profound respect, a courtly, old-world act that seemed entirely out of place in this rough, unsparing country. It was a kiss that honored her not for her beauty, but for her strength, her labor, her very being. He raised his head, his gray eyes looking directly into hers, in the quiet of the lamplit kitchen, with the scent of the supper she had cooked still lingering in the air. He spoke, his voice a low, earnest whisper. "Be my wife forever." The words struck her with the force of a physical blow. She stood perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. It was the thing she had most feared, and the thing her treacherous heart had most wanted to hear. The room was utterly silent, the only sound the faint hiss of the lamp. All of her internal battles, her fears of dependence, her struggle for identity, rushed to the forefront of her mind. She found her voice, and when she spoke, it was as quiet and steady as his had been. "I need time," she said, her eyes never leaving his. He did not drop her hand. "This is too much, too soon." She took a breath, the words she needed to say forming with a painful clarity. "We will marry only when I want to. It cannot be because I'm in your debt, or because you feel a duty to protect me. And it cannot be to silence the gossips in town. It must be my choice, a free choice, or it will be nothing at all." She had laid her soul bare, spoken her deepest fear aloud. She had given him every reason to pull his hand away, to retreat back into the formal distance they had maintained. But he did not. He simply held her hand, his thumb gently stroking her skin. He looked at her, and she saw in his eyes not frustration or impatience, but a deep and unwavering understanding. He nodded slowly. "I'll wait," he said. The two words were a promise more powerful than any flowery vow. It was an acceptance of her terms, an acknowledgement of her independence. He was not trying to possess her. He was offering to stand beside her, for as long as it took for her to be ready to stand beside him. A sense of immense relief washed over her, and with it came a new clarity. She knew, in that moment, what the terms of her own heart would require. "If that day ever comes, Cole," she said, speaking his given name for the first time, "it will be with conditions. I will not be known only as Mrs. Sullivan. I will keep my own name as well. I will be Eliza Hart. And the water rights that belong to my family, when we win them back, they will be held in my name, mine alone." It was an outrageous demand for this time and place, a claim to an identity and a power that society did not grant to women. But it was her term. It was the price of her free choice. Cole Sullivan did not even hesitate. A slow smile touched the corners of his mouth. "That seems fair," he said. "Eliza Hart." The autumn that followed Cole's proposal was a season of quiet waiting, a holding of breath before the inevitable winter. The promise he had made, "I'll wait," settled between them, a foundation stronger than any spoken vow. The valley braced itself, the ranchers of the Water Alliance stocking the central depot under Eliza's meticulous supervision. But Ezra Pike was also waiting. He made no overt moves, letting the approaching cold and the memory of the failed prairie trial do his work for him. A slow poison of fear and uncertainty. Winter did not arrive gently. It descended from the high peaks in early December of 1892, a furious onslaught of wind and snow. The world shrank. The vast valley compressed into a suffocating vortex of white. Roads disappeared. The telegraph line to the county seat went dead. Dry Creek became an island, and the Twin Spurs Ranch a fortress within it, isolated and besieged by the elements. The snow piled in prodigious drifts, burying fences and turning the landscape into a smooth, featureless expanse. For 2 weeks, the blizzard raged. The Alliance's depot became a lifeline. Eliza, no longer just a bookkeeper but the acting commander of the valley's survival, organized relief parties, sending men with sleds of flour and salted beef to the families most in need. Her authority was no longer questioned. It had been forged in fire and was now being tempered by ice. One night, in the heart of the storm, a frantic knocking came at the main house door. It was a young tenant farmer, his face a mask of terror and frozen sleet. His wife, he stammered, was in labor, her time come weeks too soon. The midwife was snowed in on the far side of the creek. There was no one else. Eliza did not hesitate. She gathered clean linens, hot water, and a bottle of laudanum from the medicine chest, pulling on the heaviest coat and boots she could find. She followed the man through the blinding, waist-deep snow to his small, wind-battered cabin. The scene inside was one of quiet panic. The young wife, Mary, was pale and frightened, her body racked with premature contractions. All of Eliza's Quaker practicality, her lifetime of quiet competence, came to the fore. She took command of the small, stuffy room, her voice a calm and reassuring presence against the shriek of the wind outside. She sent the husband to melt more snow for water. She held Mary's hand, speaking to her in low, soothing tones, wiping her brow with a cool cloth. The hours that followed were a primal struggle, a battle fought not with guns or shovels, but with whispered encouragement and sheer, unyielding will. At dawn, as the storm finally began to relent, a new sound joined the howling of the wind, the thin, wailing cry of a healthy baby boy. Eliza, exhausted but filled with a profound sense of triumph, cleaned the infant and placed him in his mother's arms. She had brought life into a world that seemed bent on extinguishing it. She had become a creator, a protector. It was during this forced isolation that Pike made his move. A lone rider, half frozen but driven by a desperate loyalty, finally made it through from a neighboring county with the news, taking advantage of the storm that had cut the valley off from the world. Ezra Pike had gone before the county commissioners, with Mayor Sterling at his side. He had presented his case. He claimed the ranchers of the Dry Creek Valley were a lawless, uncooperative bunch who were impeding the progress of the railroad, a vital engine of civilization. He produced documents, including the one signed by Eliza's father, as proof. He offered to solve the county's problem. In a secret session, he signed a contract, backed by a hefty bond, that granted his railroad company the right to divert the headwaters of the creek for construction purposes. The map Cole had seen in the mayor's office was now an official, legally binding document. They had been outmaneuvered. When Cole heard the news, a cold, dangerous fury settled in his eyes. The law had been used as a thief's tool. There was only one chance. He had to get to the county seat himself, get his hands on a copy of that contract and the minutes of that secret meeting. He had to have proof of the bribery and collusion he knew had taken place. It's a fool's errand. Peterson, the old rancher, warned him, "The pass is drifted 20 feet deep. You'll freeze before you get halfway." "If we stay, we lose everything," Cole said, his voice flat and final. "We'll be ruined by spring. I'm going. I need 2 men who can handle a snowshoe and a rifle." 2 of his best men volunteered without hesitation. The parting with Eliza was brief, conducted in the frozen air of the stable. The unspoken promise between them was a tangible thing, a current in the frigid space. He was entrusting her with his ranch, with the alliance, with the very heart of their resistance. "Keep the depot secure," he said, his hand resting for a moment on her shoulder. It was not the touch of a master to a subordinate, but of a partner. "You are in command here, Eliza Hart." "Godspeed, Cole," she whispered, her own fear a tight knot in her chest. She watched as the 3 men, small, dark figures against the vast, blinding white, disappeared into the swirling snow. The nights that followed were the longest of Eliza's life. The ranch felt empty, vulnerable. She did her duties by rote, her mind constantly on the 3 men fighting their way through the frozen hell of the high passes. The attack came on the 3rd night. The wind had picked up again, a low moan that rattled the windows and covered any sound. She was in the depot, taking a final inventory by lantern light, when she heard a splintering crash from the direction of the well. The pump handle, the iron heart of the ranch, had been shattered with a sledgehammer. She grabbed the Winchester rifle that Cole kept loaded behind the door. Her hands did not tremble. The Quaker girl who had flinched at the sight of Pike's men on the road was gone, burned away by fire and forged anew by ice. She peered out a crack in the door. In the faint, snowy moonlight, she could see them, a half-dozen dark figures, moving toward the stone depot. Pike had not waited for the law to do his work. He had sent his wolves to cripple them, to destroy their supplies and break their spirit. Eliza raised the heavy rifle, rested it on a barrel of flour, and took aim at the sky. She squeezed the trigger. The blast was deafening in the frozen silence, a tongue of orange fire that split the night. The figures froze. Then she raised her voice, not in a scream of fear, but in a clear, carrying command. "To the depot, arm yourselves. They're trying to take the depot." Lights appeared in the windows of the bunkhouse and the main house. Men, roused by the shot, came spilling out, grabbing rifles and pitchforks. Eliza fired again into the air, and then a third time. She had seen what needed to be done. "The wagons!" she shouted, her voice ringing with an authority that no one dared question. "Circle the wagons around the depot. We'll make a fort." It was an order drawn from the deepest instincts of the frontier. The men, recognizing the stark, simple wisdom of it, moved to obey. They rolled the heavy freight wagons into a defensive circle around the stone building, creating a makeshift barricade. The women and children were hurried inside the depot, and the men took up positions between the wheels, their rifles resting on the wagon beds. Pike's men, seeing the swift, organized defense, hesitated. They had expected to strike a sleeping, leaderless ranch. They had not expected this. After a tense standoff, a few probing shots were exchanged, but the attackers had lost the element of surprise. They faded back into the storm, their mission a failure. Eliza Hart had held the line. 4 agonizing days later, just as a fragile hope was beginning to fray into despair, a rider was spotted coming down from the pass. It was one of the men who had gone with Cole. He was half frozen, his horse stumbling with exhaustion. Cole and the other man were just behind him. He gasped, but they were in a bad way. They had made it. Cole returned, not as a conqueror, but as a man who had stared into the abyss and survived. He was gaunt, his face blackened by frostbite, but in a waterproof oilskin pouch clutched in his hand. He had the proof, a certified copy of Pike's contract, and, more importantly, a sworn affidavit from a disgruntled county clerk, complete with a transcription of a letter detailing the money that had been paid to Mayor Sterling for his cooperation. It was the bloody map, the evidence of their betrayal. There was no time to rest. The blizzard had broken. The roads were passable. "Just Cole," his voice a hoarse rasp, gave his orders. Riders were sent out. A public meeting was called for noon the next day. In the town square, every man, woman, and child of the valley was summoned. The square was a sea of grim faces, the townspeople and ranchers standing shoulder to shoulder in the deep, freshly fallen snow. They gathered before the steps of the general store, a makeshift forum. The pastor was there, as was a circuit-riding county councilman who had been stranded by the storm. Ezra Pike and Mayor Sterling stood on the porch, their expressions a mixture of arrogance and annoyance, ready to dismiss the proceedings as the ravings of a mob. Cole Sullivan, his face bandaged, his body stooped with exhaustion but his eyes burning with a cold fire, stood before the crowd. In the profound silence of the snow-covered square, he told them everything. He read Pike's contract aloud. He read the clerk's affidavit detailing the secret meetings and the bribes. The story unfolded, stark and ugly, a tale of greed and a profound betrayal of public trust. A low, dangerous growl began to build in the crowd. Mayor Sterling began to sputter denials, his face turning a blotchy purple. Pike, for the first time, looked uneasy. He began to edge toward the back of the porch, toward his waiting buggy. He had misjudged these simple people. He had mistaken their patience for weakness. "Lies!" he finally shouted, his voice shrill. "All of it. You have no credible witness." "Oh, I think you do," said a voice from the edge of the crowd. A path opened, and a man walked through. He was thin and poorly dressed, his face unshaven, but he walked with a new kind of purpose. It was Mac Doyle. Pike's face went white. He had paid Doyle and then abandoned him, leaving him to fend for himself after the Prairie trial. He had assumed the man had left the territory. Doyle stopped before the porch and looked up at his former employer, his eyes filled with the cold fury of a man who had been used and discarded. "He left me with nothing," Doyle said, his voice carrying in the still, cold air for all to hear. sent me on my way with a threat and not a penny of what he promised. But I kept my ledger. He held up the small, leather-bound book that had been returned to him by the marshal, and I remember every word he told me. I remember him laughing about how he was going to turn this whole valley into his own private kingdom. He looked from Pike to the crowd. I will swear to every word of this on a stack of Bibles. It was the final, devastating blow. The truth, witnessed and undeniable, had fallen upon them like the pure, white snow. Pike made a dash for his buggy, but the men of the Alliance were there to block his path. Mayor Sterling simply collapsed onto a bench, his face in his hands. The law had been slow, and it had been corrupted, but in the light of the community's shared truth, it had finally been brought to bear. In the middle of the falling snow, under the watchful eyes of the silent mountains, the people of Dry Creek had taken their valley back. The spring of 1893 arrived as a slow, steady miracle. The great mountains of snow that had buried the valley receded, not in a rush, but in a gentle, trickling surrender. The sound of running water returned to the land, a murmur at first, then a confident gurgle, then a full-throated song. The creek swelled with clean, cold snowmelt, and the newly dredged ditches, including the one that bordered the Hart homestead, ran full and deep. The water, which had been the source of so much strife, was now a symbol of a hard-won peace. The political thaw was just as decisive. Faced with Cole's evidence, Mac Doyle's testimony, and the unified anger of an entire valley, the county commissioners had no choice. Ezra Pike's contract was declared null and void, procured through fraud and coercion. A full-scale investigation into his financial dealings was launched, and rather than face the courts, Pike disappeared from the territory, his grand ambitions for a personal kingdom dissolving like a mirage. Mayor Sterling resigned in disgrace, his name a byword for weakness and corruption. The power that had seemed so absolute had proven to be hollow, unable to withstand the simple, collective weight of the truth. In the wake of this victory, the Dry Creek Water Alliance underwent a transformation. It was no longer a temporary pact for defense, but the foundation for a shared future. At a meeting in the town's small chapel, they voted to formalize their union, establishing the Dry Creek Cooperative. It would manage the water, maintain the communal depot, and act as a unified voice for the valley's interests. Cole Sullivan was elected its chairman, a role he accepted with a solemn nod, and in a move that would have been unthinkable 6 months prior. Eliza Hart was unanimously voted to the position of treasurer. The woman they had once whispered about was now the trusted guardian of their collective wealth, her ledger no longer a private record of debt, but a public testament to their shared prosperity. The new season brought a new kind of quiet to the Twin Spurs. The tension of the long siege was gone, replaced by the steady, purposeful rhythm of ranch work. Cole and Eliza's relationship, which had been forged in the crucible of flood, fire, and ice, now had the space to breathe. The unspoken promise between them was a constant, comfortable presence, a source of quiet strength rather than anxious uncertainty. They had waited, as he had vowed, and now the time had come to speak of the future they had earned. They had the conversation one evening as they sat on the porch of the main house, watching the last of the alpenglow paint the peaks of the Sangre de Cristo in shades of rose and violet. The air was cool and smelled of damp earth and new grass. "The cooperative is solid," Cole said, breaking the comfortable silence. He wasn't looking at her, but out at the valley, his valley, their valley. "Peterson and the others are already talking about building a grist mill next year." "The depot is full," Eliza replied, her hands resting quietly in her lap. "We have enough seed and salt to see every family through to the next harvest, with a surplus besides." They were speaking of practical matters, of ledgers and logistics, but they were both talking around the larger subject that lay between them. It was Eliza who finally gave it voice. "What kind of a life do you see here?" "Cole," she asked, her question direct and unadorned. "Beyond the cattle, Beyond the cooperative, what do you want to build? He turned to look at her then, and in his eyes she saw not just the cattleman and the leader, but the man who had waited. I want to build a home, he said, his voice low. A place where the work is hard but the sleep is peaceful. A place for a family. He paused, his gaze unwavering. I see a wife who is my partner in all things. I see children who are not afraid of the winter storms because they know the pantry is full and the walls are strong. A small, hesitant fear fluttered in Eliza's chest. It was not a fear of him, but of the immense, unknown territory of the life he was describing. The life of a wife, a mother. For so long, her world had been defined by duty and survival, by guarding her own small patch of ground. To open her heart to this vast new landscape felt both wonderful and terrifying. There are other children in this valley, she said, her thoughts finding their own path. The children of the Chinese crews brought in to lay the track. The children of the Mexican families who have ranched here for generations. They have no school. They have no books. A slow smile spread across Cole's face. He saw the direction of her heart, the breadth of her vision. It was not just about their own family, but about the whole family of the valley. The old land office building is empty since the agent left, he said, picking up her thread. It's small, but it's solid. It sits next to the chapel. It would make a fine schoolhouse. And we could start a fund through the cooperative, Eliza added, the idea taking firm root, the fear receding as the purpose grew stronger. A book fund, so that every child has a chance to learn to read, no matter who their parents are or what language they speak at home. In that moment, they were no longer a man and a woman skirting the edges of a proposal. They were partners, designing the blueprint of their future, a future built not just of love, but of a shared and profound sense of responsibility. Cole felt a weight lift from his own shoulders. He had worried, in the quiet hours of the night, that in asking her to be his wife, he would become a kind of owner, a master of the house who expected his will to be done. But he saw now that her will was as strong as his, her vision as clear. They would not be master and mistress. They would be partners, builders. A few days later, just as the sun was rising, casting a pale, golden light across the valley, Cole asked her to walk with him. He led her not to the porch or the parlor, but out to the fields, to the banks of the newly rebuilt ditch that flowed past her family's homestead. The water ran swift and clear, a silver ribbon binding the land. It was the place where their story had truly begun, the place of her family's ruin and their first desperate bargain. Now, it was a place of new beginnings. They stood in silence for a moment, listening to the water and the morning song of the meadowlarks. Cole reached into his pocket. He did not kneel. He stood before her, as an equal. He took her hand, the one he had first held in the lamplit kitchen, and opened his palm. Lying there was a simple ring of hammered silver, made by the town blacksmith. It was not a ring of delicate filigree or sparkling gems. It was a solid, unadorned circle, as honest and as strong as the man who offered it. Eliza Hart, he said, his voice steady and sure, I have waited, and now I'm asking, will you be my wife? He looked from the ring to her eyes, his own gaze filled with a deep and humble sincerity. He added the words that would set her free forever. If you say no, I will understand, and I will still be here tomorrow, and the day after that, guarding this water, for everyone. He was offering her a choice, as pure and as clear as the water at their feet. His love was not a cage, his proposal not a debt to be paid. His commitment was to the land, to the community, and she was invited to be his partner in that commitment, not the reason for it. The last of her fears dissolved. Her heart, which had been so carefully guarded, opened completely. Yes, she whispered. Yes, Cole, I will. He slid the silver ring onto her finger. It was cool and solid, a perfect fit, and in the light of the new day, by the banks of the flowing water, he kissed her for the first time. a kiss as honest and as true as the ring she now wore. Later that week, when Eliza told her parents, her father wept. Ephraim Hart had been a changed man since the public confrontation in the snow. The weight of his secret shame had been lifted, and in its place was a quiet humility. The following Sunday, after the service at the chapel, he stood before the small congregation. His voice, frail at first but gaining strength, filled the small room. He spoke of his own fear and weakness in the days after the flood. He publicly confessed to signing Pike's deceptive document and asked for the community's forgiveness for the trouble his actions had caused. It was an act of profound courage, and it washed the last stain of dishonor from the Hart family name. Then he turned to Cole, who was standing beside Eliza. "My daughter has chosen a good man," Ephraim said, his eyes clear. "A man of strength and honor." He paused, then made a request that surprised everyone. "It is a tradition in our Quaker faith that at a wedding, the groom wears a simple scarf, a symbol that he comes to the union not as a master, but as a humble partner. I would be honored. Cole Sullivan, if you would wear one at your wedding to my daughter." Cole looked at Eliza and saw in her shining eyes all the answer he needed. He turned back to the old man, who had offered him this symbol of a faith he did not practice, but a principle he held sacred. He inclined his head in a gesture of deep respect. "I would be proud to, Mr. Hart." They were married in the last week of August, when the hay was cut and stacked and the air held the first crisp promise of autumn. There was no church big enough to hold the gratitude of the valley, so they stood in a meadow on a rise of land on the Twin Spurs Ranch, with the great, silent wall of the Sangre de Cristo Mountains as their witness. The sky above was a deep, cloudless blue. It was a wedding built of simple, honest things. The guests sat not on polished pews, but on hay bales and wagon beds. There was no organ music, only the lively, sweet sound of a fiddle played by a Mexican vaquero from a neighboring ranch, his tunes a joyful blend of old border melodies and spirited reels. The people came not in silks and velvets, but in their Sunday best, their faces scrubbed clean and shining with a happiness that was deeply personal. This was not just the joining of a man and a woman. It was the celebration of a community that had survived, that had bent but had not broken. Every face in the crowd was a part of their story. The ranchers of the newly formed cooperative were there, their wives beside them. The women who had once whispered about Eliza now looking at her with a profound and undisguised respect. The families she had helped with provisions from the depot were there, their children shyly clutching wildflowers. Mary and her husband were there, their healthy baby boy a living testament to Eliza's strength. Even the foreman of the Chinese railroad crew, a man named Mr. Chen, had come with his family, a quiet gesture of solidarity that spoke volumes. Eliza wore a simple dress of pale blue cotton, her only adornment the hammered silver ring on her finger. She stood beside Cole, her hand resting lightly in his. Cole did not look like a cattle baron, but like a man humbled by his own good fortune. As Ephraim Hart, his eyes brimming with tears, stepped forward and gently draped the simple Quaker scarf over Cole's broad shoulders, a reverent hush fell over the crowd. Cole accepted the scarf not as an oddity, but as an honor, a symbol of the equal partnership he was entering into. The pastor's words were few, but they resonated with the truth of all they had endured. He spoke not of obedience, but of partnership, not of ownership, but of mutual care. He spoke of building a life together as one might build a strong ditch, with hard work, a shared vision, and a constant, life-giving flow of respect. When they spoke their vows, their voices were clear and steady, promises made not just to each other, but to the community that surrounded them. The celebration that followed was a feast of gratitude. Long tables were laden with roasted beef, venison, and mountains of the food that had seen them through their struggles: cornbread, baked beans, and potato salad. The fiddle played on, and as the sun began to dip toward the mountains, the meadow became a dance floor. the joyful, stomping rhythm a defiant answer to the harsh silences of the winter past. In the weeks that followed, the promises they had made to each other on the porch began to take solid form. One bright September morning, Eliza, with her father at her side, walked into town. Ephraim, his hand now fully healed, carried a long, smoothly planed board of pine. On it, in neat black letters Eliza herself had painted, were the words, "Dry Creek School." Together, they hung the sign above the door of the old, abandoned land office. A small group of children, Anglo, Mexican, and Chinese, watched from a distance, their dark eyes wide with a shy, hopeful curiosity. Eliza looked at the sign, then at the children, and felt a quiet, profound sense of purpose settle in her heart. This was the start of a different kind of harvest. At the same time, Cole was leading a work crew from the cooperative. They were not branding cattle or mending fences. They were gathered at the main diversion gate of the creek, the very spot that had been the focus of so much of Pike's greed. With sweat and teamwork, they installed a new, state-of-the-art water meter, a complex and beautiful instrument of cast iron and brass gears. It was a public and transparent measure of their most precious resource. It was a declaration, made in metal and stone, that the water belonged to everyone, its flow to be shared fairly and openly. Justice was no longer an abstract idea. It was a thing you could see and measure, its steady, ticking heart a promise of the community's shared future. Their life together found its rhythm, a peaceful cadence that echoed the changing seasons. It was a life built of small, repeated acts of labor and of love. One evening in late autumn, the day's work was done. A deep, velvety purple was settling over the valley, the first stars beginning to prick the twilight sky. Eliza was in the kitchen of the main house, the familiar, comforting space that was now truly her home. She was preparing their evening meal, her movements fluid and unhurried. The silence in the room was a world away from the defensive armor she had once worn. This was a silence of peace, of contentment, the soft bubbling of the stew on the stove, the gentle scrape of the knife on the cutting board, the whisper of her cotton dress as she moved from the counter to the pantry. These were the sounds of a life that was settled, a heart that was at rest. She was not on guard. She was not proving her worth. She was simply Eliza Hart Sullivan, a woman preparing supper for her husband, an act as natural and as necessary as breathing. Cole came in from the stables, bringing the cool, clean scent of the evening air with him. He was tired from the long day, but it was the satisfying weariness of good work done. He did not speak, but stood for a moment by the door, watching her. He watched the way the lamplight caught the stray wisps of hair at her neck, the efficient grace of her hands as she stirred the pot. He was not the owner of a ranch watching his cook. He was a husband, home from the fields, his heart filled with a quiet, overwhelming sense of peace. He walked over to her as she stood by the stove. She turned, a small, welcoming smile on her face. He took her hand, the one that wore his simple silver ring, and just as he had done on that first, terrifying, wonderful night, he turned it over and pressed his lips to the back of it. It was the same gesture, the same act of profound respect. But this time, it was not a question. It was an answer. He looked into her eyes, his own reflecting the warm, steady glow of the lamp. He whispered the words that had become their foundation, the touchstone of their shared past and the vow for their shared future. Be my wife forever. This time it was not a proposal offered into an uncertain silence. It was a prayer of thanks, a renewal of a promise that was being lived out every single day. Eliza's smile deepened. She leaned forward and kissed him, a kiss filled with the quiet confidence of a love that had been tested by the worst the world had to offer and had emerged, like the valley in springtime, stronger and more alive than ever. In the quiet of their kitchen, with the scent of their supper filling the air, they knew that true justice and true love were not things won in a single, grand battle. They were things built slowly, day by day, in the thousand small, repeated, and decent acts of a shared life. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We'd love for you to comment below with where you're listening from so we can all connect. And be sure to subscribe to our channel Wild West Night, like the video, and press that hype button to help share this story with even more people.